The morning fog lingered over Richmond like a grey shroud, curling around brick buildings and silent alleyways. Martha tightened the shawl around her shoulders, her thin fingers numb from the cold. Her children, Samuel and Clara, clung to her skirts, their small faces pale and drawn. Hunger was an ache that had settled in their bones weeks ago, but now it was an all-consuming fire. She had spent the night pacing the cramped room they rented above the blacksmith's forge, listening to the coughing of neighbors through paper-thin walls. The factory and coal wages barely covered rent, let alone the rising cost of food. Bread, once a modest comfort, had become a luxury. Every shop she passed this morning had empty shelves or the sign of high prices scrawled across their windows. Word spread quickly through the city's poorer districts. Women gathered on corners, clutching baskets and bundles of rags, their faces etched with worry and determination. Children tugged at their skirts, asking the questions that had no answers. "Mother, when will we eat?" A shout cut through the early morning quiet. It came from the bakery on Main Street, its doors barricaded with wooden planks. A woman pounded on the entrance, demanding bread for her children. Another woman joined, voices growing louder, until the murmur of the crowd became a roar. Martha felt a surge of both fear and resolve. They were not just mothers and daughters. They were a force, a living embodiment of desperation. The city's streets swelled with people, men who had labored all week in factories, their hands raw and blackened by coal dust, abandoned their work for the day, drawn by the cries. Some were street laborers who had been walking the city since dawn, hoping to earn a few coins, now joining in the chorus of protest. Hunger had erased class and rank among the struggling. They were all united by need. Martha's eyes caught a boy no older than Samuel, reaching for a loaf of bread, left unguarded at the back of a shop. A scream erupted from the baker, and the crowd surged forward. But instead of anger, a strange solidarity took over. Women shielded the boy, and men pressed close to prevent the baker from striking him. Every face in the street mirrored the same truth. Survival could justify rebellion. By midday, the riot had engulfed the entire district. Shopkeepers shuttered windows, soldiers were called in, and the air thickened with shouts, tears, and the scent of coal smoke. The authorities struggled to restore order, but the city's poorest were not concerned with law. They were concerned with life itself. In a narrow alleyway, Martha pressed her children close. She saw friends and neighbors she had known since childhood, their eyes wild with fear and determination. One by one, they shared what little food they had, forming a fragile network of survival. No one spoke of politics. No one spoke of rebellion. Yet in every act of sharing and defiance, the heartbeat of protest was undeniable. As night fell, the cries faded into the distance. The soldiers patrolled the streets, and the city seemed to breathe again. But Martha knew the struggle was far from over. Hunger would return with the sunrise, and tomorrow the streets would rise again. She held Samuel and Clara tight, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. In the quiet darkness of their tiny home, one thing was clear: the Bread Riots of 1855 were not just a protest. They were a testament to the human will to survive, to fight and to demand dignity, even when every day felt like a battle against the very world. By dawn, Richmond was no longer a quiet city waking from sleep. The streets roared with the sound of desperate voices, pounding feet, and the clatter of overturned crates. Word of yesterday's protest had spread to every district. Wherever there was a bakery or market, crowds formed like waves crashing against the walls of a city unprepared for them. Martha stepped into the throng once more, her children clinging to her skirts. Hunger had sharpened her senses. She could feel the pulse of the crowd like a living thing, hear the fear and determination woven together in every shout. Around her, women carried wooden spoons and rolling pins, not as weapons, but as symbols of their daily struggle, a testament to lives spent feeding families who could barely survive. A group of men, factory laborers whose hands bore the marks of coal and sweat, had blocked the path of a wealthy grocer's carriage. Their voices demanded lower prices, fairer distribution, and most urgently bread. The grocer pressed his whip, trying to force the carriage through. But the crowd would not yield. Someone threw a small loaf into the street. It landed near Martha, and she quickly handed it to Samuel, who clutched it as though it were gold. Hunger made every crumb a treasure, every bite a victory. In another part of the city, soldiers and policemen attempted to form lines, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythm. Orders were shouted, sticks were raised, and yet the crowds pressed forward. This was not a rebellion born of ideology or politics. It was a rebellion born of survival. Mothers shielded children, street workers locked arms, and every citizen's desperation became a force no law could contain. Martha noticed a young woman barely older than herself, confronting a shopkeeper who refused to sell bread at anything less than the inflated price. The woman's voice trembled with rage and fear. "My children will not starve, so you may profit," she shouted. Around them, more citizens joined, forming a human barrier around the baker. It was chaos, yet strangely organized. Each act of defiance fueled the next, like sparks igniting a fire. The authorities were at their wits' end. Soldiers fired warning shots into the air, hoping to disperse the crowd. But the people would not retreat. Hunger had stripped away fear. Even as smoke from overturned carts and torches filled the air, mothers, children, and laborers moved forward, chanting for sustenance and dignity. Martha's mind raced. How had it come to this? Just weeks ago, life had been hard but bearable. Coal dust in the lungs, long hours at the factories, and a loaf of bread once a week. That was all they needed. Now the city had become a battlefield where survival and desperation dictated every movement. Among the chaos, Martha glimpsed familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even strangers, who had once shared a kind word now, standing shoulder to shoulder in protest. A young boy snatched a loaf and ran down the alley, pursued by a soldier. The crowd surged after him, and suddenly, the line between protest and riot blurred. Those who had never imagined themselves capable of rebellion found themselves at the front lines, driven by need more than ideology. As the sun climbed, the city's landscape changed. Windows were shattered, carts overturned, and the once quiet streets were alive with cries of "Bread, bread." Martha and her children wove through the crowd, keeping close to others they knew. She saw acts of generosity amid chaos. A man tearing open his coat to share the meager rations he had brought from home. A mother passing a loaf to a stranger's child. By evening, Richmond had become a city transformed. Fires burned in the alleys, barricades had been erected, and soldiers were worn down from hours of attempting to restore order. Martha returned home, arms heavy with the weight of exhaustion, but her spirit was unbroken. Hunger still gnawed at them, but something had shifted. The streets had spoken, and their voices, desperate, unified, indignant, had been heard. Martha looked at Samuel and Clara, their small faces smeared with dust and tears. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we will try again. We will survive." And in that whispered promise lay the heartbeat of Richmond itself. A city where survival was not just a need, but a force strong enough to ignite rebellion, compassion and courage in equal measure. The morning after the riots, Richmond was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Smoke still curled from smoldering carts and overturned stalls, and shards of glass glistened like tiny wounds in the cobblestone streets. The city's officials inspected the damage with grim faces, noting the burned crates, smashed windows and empty shelves. Yet for the mothers, children and laborers, the cost was measured differently, by the stomachs still empty, the bodies still aching, and the fear that tomorrow might bring the same struggle. Martha stepped out into the early light, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her children by her side. Samuel clutched a small piece of bread they had scavenged from the bakery ruins. Clara held her mother's hand, her eyes wide but determined. Martha surveyed the streets, recognizing neighbors who had fought beside her, their faces pale, worn, and marked by fatigue. Hunger had left them changed. There was no pride in the battle, only survival and the knowledge that ordinary life could vanish in a moment of desperation. The authorities had restored a fragile order. Soldiers marched through the streets, not with triumph but with wariness. They had learned that hunger could override fear, that a mother defending her child could stand taller than any lawman. Some shopkeepers, chastened by the courage of the crowds, lowered prices slightly, or distributed what little they had left. But the city's poor knew that these gestures were temporary, and tomorrow could be just as unforgiving. In the alley behind her home, Martha encountered the young woman she had seen confronting the baker during the riots. They shared a silent nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had survived something far larger than themselves. The riot had not changed the structure of Richmond or erased the poverty that plagued them, but it had changed them. Courage had been awakened by necessity, and the streets themselves had become a testament to the human spirit under duress. Martha returned home exhausted and set Samuel and Clara down at the tiny wooden table. She broke the bread into small pieces, savoring every crumb. Hunger had not been defeated, but a sense of agency had emerged. They had been seen, heard, and counted. That knowledge, small and fragile though it was, carried a weight heavier than any coin. Across Richmond, families shared the same quiet resolve. Mothers whispered stories of bravery to their children. Fathers recounted the small victories that had helped them endure. Even the soldiers, the officials, and the shopkeepers could not ignore the lesson. Poverty and hunger were forces far stronger than intimidation or law, and when basic needs went unmet, survival would always spark rebellion. By the end of the week, Richmond had begun to return to its rhythm, but the echoes of the Bread Riots lingered in every corner. Children played among the debris, learning that the world was both cruel and resilient. Women like Martha carried the memory of courage forward, teaching the next generation that survival demanded both heart and action. The Bread Riots of 1855 were not remembered for banners or political speeches. They were remembered for the quiet heroism of ordinary people who refused to surrender to hunger. Hunger had transformed mothers, children, laborers, and street workers into something larger than themselves, a community united by need, courage, and the unyielding human will to survive. And in the years that followed, when Richmond's streets became quieter, Martha would tell Samuel and Clara about the days the city rose together, about the power in their collective voice, and about the simple, fierce truth that even in the shadow of poverty, life could be defended, dignity could be claimed, and courage could flourish.